Jerusalem fell in the autumn of 1187, not after years of grinding siege warfare, not after a slow, agonizing collapse. It fell in 12 days. A city that Christian armies had bled across an entire continent to reach. A city that had stood as the crown of the Crusader world for nearly 90 years, surrendered in less than 2 weeks. And the question that should follow you into this story is a simple one. How does something like that happen? How does a kingdom that had survived for nearly a century simply come apart at the seams so fast that almost nobody had time to stop it? That question is worth sitting with, because the answer isn't just about one battle, or one bad decision, or one brilliant enemy. It's about a kingdom that had been quietly breaking long before the walls were ever threatened. Let's go back to where the cracks started. By the late 1170s, the kingdom of Jerusalem was being held together by a man who was slowly dying. Baldwin IV, the leper king, was remarkable in almost every sense. He led armies from horseback when his body had largely stopped obeying him. He won battles. He made decisions that more able-bodied rulers might have flinched from. But leprosy was not something you governed your way out of. And by the early 1180s, the question of succession had become an obsession at court, and an opening for every ambitious nobleman in the kingdom. Baldwin died in 1185. He was around 24 years old. His heir was his young nephew, Baldwin V, a child of perhaps 7 or 8, who lasted barely a year before dying too. What followed was something close to a political free-for-all. The crown passed to Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had married Baldwin IV's sister Sibylla, and who was widely regarded by the old guard of the kingdom's nobility as an outsider and a lightweight. Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced lords in the region, had expected influence over any regency. Instead, he found himself sidelined and furious. The kingdom's most capable men were either dying, aging, or at each other's throats. It was exactly the kind of internal fracture that an enemy with patience and ambition could exploit. And Saladin had both. He had spent years unifying the fractured Muslim world around him, Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, pulling rival powers into alignment through a combination of military pressure and political calculation. He wasn't simply waiting for the Crusaders to weaken. He was building something large enough to overwhelm them when the moment came. And by 1187, the moment was nearly there. What pushed it over the edge was a man named Reynold of Châtillon. Reynold was the lord of the Transjordan, a veteran of the Crusader Wars with a long history of ignoring both diplomacy and common sense when it inconvenienced him. In 1187, he attacked a Muslim caravan crossing his territory, violating a truce that had been painfully negotiated. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. He had previously launched a naval raid into the Red Sea, threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and sending a tremor of outrage through the Islamic world. Saladin had sworn to kill him personally. When Reynold broke the truce in 1187, it gave Saladin exactly the justification he needed. And by that point, he didn't need much. He crossed into Crusader territory with a large, well-organized army that summer. What followed was a campaign that turned on a single catastrophic decision. The Crusader field army had assembled near the springs at Zafuria, a defensible position with fresh water and solid ground. Raymond of Tripoli, whatever his political grievances, understood the stakes clearly. Stay put, let Saladin overextend. don't give him the pitched battle he wanted. It was sound advice. Guy of Lusignan, new to the throne and desperate to prove himself, ignored it. Partly through pressure from his own nobles, partly perhaps from the fear of looking weak, he ordered the army to march out and engage. What that march looked like in practice was a column of heavily armored men moving through the scorched hills of Galilee in July, one of the most punishing environments in the region at one of the most punishing times of year. Saladin's forces harassed them constantly, cutting them off from water, lighting fires on the hillsides to thicken the smoke and the heat. By the time the Crusaders reached the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin on the 4th of July, 1187, they were dehydrated, exhausted, and surrounded. The battle that followed was less a fight than a systematic destruction. The Crusader infantry broke and collapsed. The cavalry tried to charge and failed to break through. Some managed to flee. Most did not. By the end of the day, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army, the professional corps that had defended the kingdom for decades, was gone, killed or captured, almost to a man. King Guy was taken prisoner. The leading nobles of the kingdom were in chains. Renaud of Châtillon was captured too, and Saladin, true to his word, executed him personally. The True Cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, which had been carried into battle as a symbol of divine protection, was seized and never returned. And there, in the smoke and the wreckage on the slopes of Hattin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost something it could not replace. Not territory, not castles, not treasure. It lost the men. The trained, experienced soldiers who were the only thing standing between the civilian population of Jerusalem and whatever came next. Saladin now had an open road, and Jerusalem, sitting behind its ancient walls, was largely on its own. What happened next was not a slow advance. It was a sweep. In the weeks after Hattin, Saladin moved with a speed and coordination that must have felt, to the people watching from the walls of their towns, almost surreal. The kingdom's field army was gone. The men who would have marched out to relieve a siege, or blocked a road, or bought time for a garrison to hold, they were dead or in captivity. What remained was a scattering of isolated strongholds, each one now staring outward at a landscape they no longer controlled, waiting to see where Saladin would strike next. He struck everywhere, more or less at once. Acre fell first, one of the great ports of the eastern Mediterranean, a city that moved wealth, soldiers, and pilgrims between Europe and the Holy Land, and it surrendered within days of Hattin. The garrison simply didn't have the numbers to hold it. Then Nablus, then Jaffa, which gave him a foothold on the central coast, then Sidon, then Beirut up in the north, cutting off the land routes that connected the surviving Crusader territories in Lebanon to the heart of the kingdom, and then Ascalon, down in the south, guarding the old road into Egypt. One by one, the coastal cities that formed the skeleton of the Crusader state were taken, surrendered, or abandoned, and with each one that fell, the cities still standing became a little more isolated, a little more alone. There is a description, preserved in one of the Arabic chronicles of the period, of Saladin's forces spreading across the Levant like ants, patient, purposeful, covering the ground in every direction at once. It's a striking image, and it captures something true about the strategy. This wasn't just conquest for the sake of territory. It was a deliberate effort to hollow out the kingdom, to empty it of the resources, the communication lines, and the breathing room that Jerusalem would need to withstand what was coming. By the time Saladin turned his attention toward the city itself, Jerusalem was not so much a fortress as a pocket of resistance in the middle of a landscape that had already changed hands. And time was the other thing Saladin understood. He had studied the Crusader world carefully enough to know how it functioned. He knew that news traveled slowly by ship across the Mediterranean. He knew that kings had their own wars, their own debts, their own political entanglements. He knew that if word of Hattin reached Europe in the summer of 1187, and it would, the earliest any serious response could be assembled and transported and actually land on the shores of the Levant would be years away. Not months. Years. The window was there. It wouldn't stay open forever. Jerusalem had to fall before the ships arrived. That urgency shaped everything about the campaign's pace. The rapid reduction of the coastal cities wasn't just logistically sensible. It was a race against the slow machinery of European response. Every city that fell before a rescue fleet could organize was one less potential landing point, one less resupply base, one less route by which a counterattack could be mounted. Saladin was not simply winning, he was sealing the exits. By September of 1187, he had done enough. The kingdom had been peeled back to a handful of remaining strongholds. Tyre, holding grimly on the coast, would prove stubborn enough to resist him. But the interior was largely his. Jerusalem stood, filled now with a flood of refugees who had poured in from the fallen cities. Priests, merchants, knights without horses, civilians without anywhere else to go. The city that had once been the crown of the Crusader world was swelling with frightened people and running desperately short of the one thing it needed most: fighting men. Saladin arrived with his army in the 3rd week of September. His first instinct was to position his forces on the western side of the city, the approach that faced the flat, open ground from which a conventional assault would be most natural. But he found quickly that this wasn't the ground he wanted. The Crusader defenders, whatever their disadvantages in numbers, could make sortie from the gates and contest the approaches, and the western terrain offered them too many opportunities to do exactly that. So he moved. He circled the city and repositioned his forces near the Mount of Olives, to the east, ground that gave his archers and his engineers better angles, reduced the defenders' ability to push out and disrupt the siege works, and placed the weight of his assault on a stretch of wall where the pressure could be sustained more efficiently. It was a cold, calculated adjustment. No wasted movement, no pride about holding an initial position, just a general reading the terrain and doing what the terrain told him. The defenders inside Jerusalem looked out at that army and understood, with whatever clarity people find in moments like that the mathematics were not in their favor. One man who arrived in those final days, Balian of Ibelin, one of the few significant lords still free and still fighting, had ridden in under a promise of safe conduct to collect his family. He ended up staying. He had almost no choice. The city essentially handed him its defense, and what he had to work with was barely 14 knights. 14, for walls that stretched for miles around one of the most significant cities on earth. He did what he could. He dubbed new knights from the squires and the townspeople, and the men who had never held a proper title but could hold a sword. He organized. He prepared. He looked at what he had, and he tried to make it mean something. Saladin's siege engines were already being assembled on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. September 20th, 1187. The net had closed, and the 12 days had begun. 12 days, from the 20th of September to the 2nd of October, 1187. That is what it took to end something that had stood for nearly 90 years. The siege opened with arrows. Saladin's archers pressed close to the walls in rotating waves. Not a single devastating volley, but a sustained, grinding pressure designed to keep the defenders pinned, to make every man on the battlements pay a cost simply for standing there. Behind the archers, the engineers were working. Siege towers, mangonels, the slow, patient machinery of a professional army that had done this before and knew exactly how it was supposed to go. The noise alone, the creak of timber, the snap of catapult arms, the endless drumbeat of stone on stone, would have been its own kind of weapon. Inside the walls, the mood was something that sits between courage and despair and refuses to become either one completely. The city was crowded. The refugees who had flooded in from the fallen coastal towns packed the streets and the squares. Thousands of people with nowhere else to go and nothing to do but wait and pray and watch the walls. Experienced soldiers were desperately thin on the ground. Baldwin of Ibelin, who had arrived with fewer than 14 knights, an almost absurdly small number for a city of this scale, had done what he could in those first days. He had dubbed new knights from squires, from burgesses, from men who had the will if not the training, raising 60 of them to something resembling fighting status. It was improvisation under the most extreme possible pressure, and the chronicles give you the sense that everyone involved understood it for what it was. Not a solution, but a refusal to simply surrender the form of resistance. The defenders organized their sections of wall. They made sorties when they could, pushing out through the gates to disrupt the siege works, buying time in whatever increments were available. But the sorties couldn't change the underlying arithmetic. There were simply too many men on the other side, and too few on this one. Each day that passed, the siege engines found their angles, the arrows did their quiet work, and the walls that had been built and rebuilt and repaired over centuries absorbed a little more of what was being thrown at them. Saladin's engineers shifted their focus to a section of wall in the north of the city, near what the sources describe as a stretch of ground more favorable for mining operations. This was the other blade of the siege, the work that happened below the surface, invisible from the battlements, where tunnels were dug beneath the foundations of the wall to hollow out the supports and cause a section to collapse. It was slow work and dangerous work, but it was methodical. And by the 29th of September, 9 days into the siege, it succeeded. A section of the wall gave way. A breach opened. For a moment, or what must have felt like a moment, though it was probably a frantic stretch of hours, the defense nearly shattered. If Saladin had poured his forces through that breach immediately, the city might have fallen in blood the way it fell in blood in 1099. The defenders scrambled to the gap, fighting in the rubble, while the engineers tried desperately to shore up what remained. They held it. But they knew, and Saladin's commanders knew, and anyone watching from either side knew, that this was not something they could keep doing. The breach could be widened. The mining could continue. What had happened once could happen again, and next time the weight behind it might be enough to sweep through. It was at this point that Baldwin of Ibelin walked out of the city gates to talk to Saladin. The negotiations that followed were not simple, and the sources don't quite agree on every detail of how they unfolded. What seems clear is that Baldwin came with an offer of surrender, and that Saladin's initial response was something between reluctance and refusal. He had wanted Jerusalem taken, not given. There are accounts, later perhaps shaped by the mythology that would grow up around both men, of Balian threatening that if Saladin refused terms, the defenders would destroy the city themselves before allowing it to be captured, kill the Muslim prisoners held inside the walls, tear down the holy sites, burn what could be burned. Whether this threat was made in precisely those words, and whether Saladin found it credible, is the kind of thing that gets lost between chronicle and legend. But the negotiation continued, and Saladin agreed to terms. The terms he offered were a ransom. 10 dinars for every man inside the city, 5 for every woman, 2 for every child. Those who could pay within a set period would go free, with safe conduct to Crusader-held territory. The rest would not. The city's leaders then negotiated a lump payment on behalf of those who couldn't meet the individual sums. The sources suggest something in the range of 30,000 dinars, covering perhaps 7,000 people. The exact figures are genuinely uncertain. Different chronicles give different numbers, and the total population inside the walls at the time of the surrender is itself a matter of real debate. Estimates cluster, somewhere around 20,000, but that number carries all the imprecision you'd expect from medieval accounting in a crisis. What isn't really disputed is the consequence for those who fell outside the arrangement. People who had no money and no one to pay for them were enslaved. The sources suggest the numbers were large, somewhere in the range of 15,000 people, though again, the exact figure is contested, left Jerusalem in chains rather than on their own feet. Queen Sibylla, the widow of Guy of Lusignan's claim to the throne, had already fallen from the political picture. Noble women of sufficient standing were largely permitted to leave with their households and their dignity intact. Some ransoms were paid privately by wealthy individuals or by the city's institutions. Saladin himself, by multiple accounts, released a portion of the elderly and the destitute without payment, though how large a portion and how consistently this was applied is the sort of detail that resists clean reconstruction. What we can say is that the surrender of Jerusalem in 1187 was materially different in character from its conquest in 1099. There was no massacre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was closed for perhaps 3 days before being reopened. Muslim holy sites were cleansed and restored. The cross was removed from the dome of the rock, and then the city, which had been the center of the Christian world in the East for almost a century, went on. On the 2nd of October, 1187, which happened to fall on the 27th of Rajab, the anniversary in the Islamic calendar of the Prophet's night journey to Jerusalem. The gates opened and the city changed hands. The defenders and the ransomed made their way out, some toward the coast, some toward Tyre, which was still holding. The mood among them, as far as the sources capture it, was the mood of people who have survived something they weren't sure they would survive, and who are not yet sure what survival means for them from here. The kingdom they had known was gone. The capital was gone. The roads, the cities, the familiar shape of the world they had lived in, most of it was gone. What remained was a rump of coastal territory, a few determined garrisons, and the knowledge that somewhere in Europe, word was traveling, slowly, by ship and by messenger, toward kings who would eventually have to decide what they were going to do about it. Saladin stood in Jerusalem and ordered the city prepared for what it now was, the holy city of Islam, restored at last. The 12 days were over. What they had set in motion was just beginning. When the last columns of Latin refugees had gone and the great gates closed again, Jerusalem did not fall silent. It shifted, almost audibly, from one order of life to another. In the first days, that shift was measured in people. Rough estimates suggest perhaps 20,000 souls had been inside the walls at the moment of surrender. By the time the counting, such as it was, could be done, something like 15,000 of them had been marched away as slaves. Men, women, and children who had not been able to find 10 dinars, or 5, or 2, or anyone willing to pay it for them. The process was bureaucratic as much as it was brutal. Lists, groups, lines of frightened people brought forward to see whether they carried coin, or could name a patron with coin, or could be folded into the collective ransom that the city's leaders had scraped together. About 7,000 were covered by that pooled payment of some 30,000 dinars, their freedom bought in bulk by the last efforts of a dying kingdom. Others were redeemed privately. Noble families and great houses found ways to protect their own. Queen Maria, the Byzantine-born widow of King Amalric and stepmother of Baldwin IV, left with safe conduct. So did many of the higher-ranking noblewomen, their households trailing behind them, diminished but intact. Below that level, the picture darkens. People who had once owned small shops, tilled small plots, served in small retinues, the ordinary fabric of the city, discovered the distinction between having nothing and being nothing in the eyes of the men with the lists. Some were released through Saladin's charity. Muslim chroniclers emphasize his orders to free certain groups of the poor, the elderly, and the pious without payment. Latin accounts, written by those who watched friends and relatives led away in chains, tend to notice the ones who were not spared. Somewhere in the space between those perspectives sits a reality that was, for thousands, a one-way walk out of the city and into someone else's property. If you pull back from those lines and look at Jerusalem itself, what you see changing most quickly are the holy places. For nearly a century, the city's sacred geography had been mapped in Latin Christian terms. Now, Saladin moved to restore an older map. The Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, had been the Templum Domini in Crusader usage, the temple of the Lord, crowned with a cross. Under Saladin's orders, the cross came down from the dome of the rock. The building was cleansed, rededicated, its surfaces washed, its inscriptions reasserted. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had housed the headquarters of the Knights Templar, was reconsecrated as a place of Muslim prayer. Calligraphers, imams, and jurists arrived alongside soldiers, reweaving legal rights and ritual obligations around a space Muslims believed had never ceased to be theirs, even in exile. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, by contrast, was treated with a kind of austere restraint. For 3 days, Saladin ordered it closed. Some later writers give this a symbolic weight. 3 days of denial mirroring 3 days in the tomb. But the simpler explanation may be that he wanted control and assessment before crowds began to move again. When it reopened, it did so not as a ruin or a mosque, but as a functioning Christian shrine under new rules. Those rules were pragmatic. Latin Christian control of the city was gone. Latin Christian pilgrimage to the city was not. Saladin allowed Western pilgrims to continue to visit the Holy Sepulchre and other Christian holy sites, provided they paid a fee. For Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syriac, Armenian, the arrangement was often easier. They had been there before the Crusaders. They had worshipped under Muslim rule before. Most of their churches remained in their hands. Their liturgies continued. Jewish life also returned. Under Latin rule, Jews had been largely excluded from living in Jerusalem, their presence allowed only intermittently and in small numbers. Saladin's administration permitted Jewish families and scholars to resettle, and within a generation you find references to organized Jewish communities, once more walking the streets of a city that had been theirs in memory for far longer than any Crusader state had existed. Later centuries would make much of this moment. In European romances and Victorian histories, Saladin appears as the model of chivalrous tolerance. In some modern retellings from the Muslim world, he becomes almost a paragon of wise, gentle justice. There is truth in the contrast they draw between the negotiated ransom and the opened churches of 1187 and the indiscriminate slaughter that accompanied the Crusader capture of the city in 1099, when Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were cut down in the streets and the synagogues burned with their congregations inside. But the reality of 1187 is more mixed than myth. Saladin did show clemency by the standards of his age. He also presided over the forced enslavement of a large part of the city's population. His policy was not modern pluralism. It was a careful, confident reassertion of Muslim rule that could accommodate other faiths on terms he set and controlled. Outside the walls, the political map was drawing itself again. With Jerusalem gone, the Latin kingdom needed a new heart. For a brief, tense period, that role fell to Tyre, perched on its island and peninsulas, defended by Conrad of Montferrat. Tyre held out against Saladin's attempts to take it. It became the default refuge, the place where fugitives from Jerusalem and the inland castles washed up if they could reach the coast at all. Royal titles, such as they still meant anything, were spoken there. Letters went out from there, telling Europe what had happened. Later, as the Third Crusade bled its way back into the Levant and began to reclaim strong points along the shore, Acre would eclipse Tyre. The fall and then the recapture of Acre turned it into the de facto capital of a reconstituted, mostly coastal kingdom, a narrow chain of ports and fortresses looking inland at lands it no longer controlled. Jerusalem, the city that had given the kingdom its name, remained outside its grasp. News of that loss took weeks to cross the sea. When it arrived, it did not arrive silently. On the 29th of October, 1187, Pope Gregory VIII issued a bull from northern Italy. Its title was Audita Tremendi, on hearing the dreadful news. The text was part lament, part exhortation, part theological explanation for a catastrophe that seemed to demand one. The fall of Jerusalem was framed as both punishment for sin and a summons to repentance through action. Out of that shock grew what we now call the Third Crusade. Kings who had once maneuvered against each other in France and Germany began, however reluctantly, to look eastward. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging emperor, took the cross. So did Philip II of France. So did Richard of Poitiers, who would become Richard I of England, lionized in his own time as a model of knightly prowess, and in later legend as Saladin's opposite number, Their armies would not arrive for years. When they did, they would fight Saladin's successors along the same coastline where refugees from Jerusalem had once stumbled toward ships and fortresses. Acre would fall and change hands. Battles would be won, treaties signed. But Jerusalem itself would not return to Latin Christian control. In the memory of those who wrote about it afterward, the 12 days of siege and the weeks that followed cast a long shadow. For Muslim chroniclers, Saladin's capture of Jerusalem was the fulfillment of a religious duty and a political project. The recovery of a city that had been lost to outsiders, accomplished in a way that could be held up as principled and honorable. They remembered his refusal to repeat the bloodletting of 1099 as a mark of moral as well as military victory. For many Western writers, especially in later centuries, that same restraint became the foundation for a curious admiration of the man who had defeated their side, a sense that even in defeat, the story could be shaped into one of mutual respect between worthy enemies. And yet, beneath the rhetoric of chivalry and divine will, the facts remain stubborn. A city changed hands, thousands left in chains, others walked away with their lives parceled out in coin. Sanctuaries were washed and reconsecrated. Pilgrims came and went under new arrangements. One kingdom shrank to a strip of coastline. Another sense of order took its place within the same walls and streets. If you stand imaginatively on that threshold, the moment after the gates closed on the last departing column, with the dust still hanging in the autumn air, what you see is not a clean break between eras, but a quieter, more human continuity. The same stones, the same hills, the same patterns of prayer facing in different directions. Empires rise, kings crash against one another's ambitions, treaties are signed and broken. But cities like Jerusalem persist by absorbing each change, letting the noise of conquest fade until it becomes one more layer in a very long memory. The siege of 1187 ended in negotiation rather than in fire. Its mercy was partial, its harshness real, its legacy tangled. And somewhere beyond the dates and the names and the numbers, there is simply this. For a few days in early October, the course of two civilizations bent around a single set of open gates, and then the world, as it always does, went on.